A dealer in London paid $42,000 for a steel Daytona last spring. Reputable seller, full kit, original receipt, green seal intact. He had bought from this source before without a problem. He sold it within a week to a collector who took it to a watchmaker for a service, and the watchmaker opened the case back and called him. The movement inside was not a Rolex movement, not an obvious fake, not the kind of movement that fools nobody. A purpose-built clone movement with finishing work that had passed two previous owners, a reputable gray market dealer, and the kind of surface inspection that gray market transactions typically involve. The watch had been in and out of the secondary market twice before anyone looked at what was actually inside it. The dealer refunded the collector. He is still trying to recover his money from the seller who misrepresented the watch to him. That process is ongoing. The watch is sitting in a dispute that has no clean resolution because the chain of ownership is long enough that establishing exactly when and where the movement was swapped is practically impossible. That story is not an isolated incident. It is a preview of a problem that is accelerating into something the gray market has never dealt with at this scale, and the consequence for prices is already visible to anyone watching the transaction data closely enough. Subscribe to the channel. It helps keep this going and is genuinely appreciated. To understand what is happening right now, the starting point is understanding what superfakes have become, because the version of this conversation that happened 5 years ago is completely outdated. The counterfeit watch industry went through a quality revolution over the past decade that produced a category of product that the original term fake no longer adequately describes. The watches being produced by the highest tier operations in the manufacturing corridors of southern China are not the obviously wrong pieces that customs agents had been seizing for decades. They are watches built with genuine attention to the details that authentication relies on. Correct case dimensions, correct bracelet construction, correct dial printing, and correct movement profile when viewed through a case back. The laser engraved crown at 6 o'clock is present. The Rehaut engraving is there. The Cyclops lens magnifies at approximately the correct ratio. The movement situation is where the most significant development happened, and it is the development that makes the current gray market contamination problem possible in the way it is playing out. Earlier generations of fakes used movements that were obviously wrong to any trained eye the moment the caseback was opened. The architecture was different. The finishing was absent. The rotor was lightweight and made of visibly inferior material. An experienced watchmaker could identify the fake in 30 seconds of movement inspection. The top-tier operations that emerged over the past 5 years did something different. They invested in purpose-built clone movements designed specifically to replicate the visual profile of genuine Rolex calibers without attempting to copy the proprietary engineering. The finishing on these movements is not identical to a genuine caliber. Under close examination by an expert with the right reference knowledge, it is distinguishable. But the gap that existed between a fake movement and a genuine one, the gap that made casual caseback inspection reliable, has narrowed enough that it is no longer a reliable frontline filter. When a gray market dealer does a surface inspection and sees a watch that looks right from the outside, they have historically had reasonable confidence. The assumption that if the exterior passes, the interior is genuine was based on the logic that nobody was producing fake movements of sufficient quality to fool a trained eye. That assumption is now wrong for the highest tier of production. And the gray market pricing system, the premium that genuine watches command over retail, was built entirely on that assumption being correct. Here is what the gray market contamination actually looks like, because the mechanism matters for understanding why it is accelerating rather than being contained. A superfake does not enter the gray market as a new watch being sold as genuine by someone who knows it is fake. That route exists, but it is not the primary problem. The primary problem is the secondary and tertiary transaction. A high-quality fake enters the market somewhere in the supply chain, sometimes sold to a buyer who knows it is not genuine, sometimes sold to a buyer who does not know and does not check carefully enough. That watch then gets resold. The second buyer, who may have purchased it as a genuine watch from someone representing it as such, sells it again. Each transaction adds provenance depth. A watch that has passed through 2 or 3 owners, with paperwork that looks right and no history of anyone questioning its authenticity, develops a transaction record that makes it look legitimate, regardless of what is inside it. The gray market has always operated on a degree of trust, the assumption that the chain of ownership behind a watch reflects its actual status. That assumption is being systematically exploited by the quality improvement in superfake production, and the gray market has not yet developed inspection infrastructure that reliably catches the problem before a transaction is completed. The price consequences are direct and immediate for anyone watching the data. Genuine Rolex steel sport references on the gray market have been softening in a way that the general correction narrative, the collapse of the bubble from 2021 to 2022, does not fully explain. The correction is real and accounts for a significant portion of the price movement. But dealers who track specific references closely are seeing price behavior in 2025 and 2026 that goes beyond what the correction alone would predict. The steel Daytona is the clearest example. The gray market premium has compressed from the peak, but is now compressing further and faster in the secondary market specifically, not in the new and unworn segment, but in the watches that have been traded 1 or more times. The market is pricing in a contamination risk that was not priced before, and it is doing that imperfectly and inconsistently because nobody has a clean number for the probability that any given gray market watch is genuine. When a risk cannot be quantified cleanly, the market discounts more than the risk actually requires. The fear of unknowable contamination is more damaging to prices than a known contamination rate would be. Every genuine watch in the secondary market is now competing against the possibility, not the certainty, but the possibility that it might be the London dealer's Daytona. That possibility is worth something to the buyer, and what it is worth comes off the price. Subscribe to the channel. This kind of analysis takes real time, and the support makes a difference. The dealers are in an impossible position, and their response to that position is creating the second wave of the price problem. A reputable gray market dealer builds their business on being a reliable source, on buyers trusting that when they purchase from that dealer, they are getting what they are paying for. The authentication infrastructure those dealers have developed was built for a previous era of fakes. Light inspection, visual verification, perhaps a quick movement peek through the case back. That infrastructure does not reliably catch the current generation of super fakes. Dealers facing this reality have 2 options. The first is to invest in authentication capability that actually works for the current problem. Full movement inspection by a qualified watchmaker on every piece before it is purchased, systematic comparison against reference movements, and documentation of the authentication process for every transaction. That is expensive. It slows the throughput of the business, and it requires either hiring watchmakers or developing partnerships that add cost to every transaction. The second option is to lower prices on secondary market pieces to reflect the risk that their authentication cannot fully eliminate. That is the option most of the market is currently taking because it is faster and requires no infrastructure investment. The consequence is systematic discounting of genuine secondary market watches because dealers cannot efficiently distinguish them from sophisticated fakes without slowing and complicating every transaction. Both options produce lower prices. The first produces them because the authentication cost has to be recovered somewhere. The second produces them because the risk premium comes directly off the offer price. The genuine watch owner who wants to sell today is selling into a market where both pathways are being pursued simultaneously, and the combined effect on prices is significant. The authentication failure has a specific technical dimension that explains why the current situation is harder to solve than previous fake quality improvements were. Rolex's anti-counterfeiting measures, the laser crown at 6 o'clock on the crystal, the Rehaut serial engraving, and the NFC chip and documentation for newer watches were each designed as layers of a system where multiple independent checks would collectively be reliable, even if any single check could be defeated. The logic was sound when the counterfeit quality was lower. The super fake production that has emerged has addressed each of these layers specifically rather than generally. The laser crown exists on current top-tier fakes. It is not identical to the genuine article under close expert examination with proper lighting. The rehoud engraving is present and approximates the correct font and depth closely enough that it passes the visual check most dealers apply. The NFC documentation issue is circumvented in the gray market by the simple fact that a large percentage of transactions occur without original sealed documentation because watches have been opened, resold, or traded before original documentation was preserved. What remains as a reliable authentication layer is movement inspection by someone with genuine reference expertise who has physically handled enough genuine Rolex calibers to recognize the specific finishing characteristics, the specific weight and behavior of the rotor, and the specific visual geometry of the bridge and platework. That expertise exists. It is not widely distributed, it is not fast, and it cannot be scaled to match the volume of gray market transactions that occur globally on any given day. The market is operating with an authentication gap that it has not yet figured out how to close efficiently. Until it does, the gap is reflected in prices. The people who benefit from this situation are not the dealers and not the collectors. They are the super fake manufacturers who have created a product that has effectively contaminated an entire market category at the highest end of their production quality, and the buyers who understand exactly what they are purchasing and are happy to pay the gray market super fake price for something they know is not genuine. That second category is worth acknowledging directly because it complicates the morality of the current situation in ways that are uncomfortable. The gray market premium for a genuine steel Daytona exists because the watch is scarce at authorized dealers and because genuine demand for it exceeds supply at retail. The buyer who pays that premium is paying specifically for authenticity, for the knowledge that what they are acquiring is the thing it claims to be. The super fake buyer who pays a fraction of that premium is making a completely different kind of transaction, one they enter knowingly. The problem the gray market faces is that the transaction record of the super fake becomes indistinguishable from the transaction record of the genuine watch once it has been in the secondary market long enough. The watch that was purchased knowingly as a fake gets resold, perhaps by someone who bought it without understanding what they had, perhaps by someone who understood and is deliberately introducing it into the genuine market. The contamination mechanism is not dependent on bad intent at every node. It is dependent on the opacity of the secondary market chain and the authentication gap that makes the genuine and the fake operationally equivalent in most gray market inspection contexts. The practical consequence for a buyer in the current market is that the due diligence required for a gray market secondary purchase has fundamentally changed from what it was 3 years ago. A reputable dealer with a good track record is no longer sufficient protection because reputable dealers are themselves operating with authentication infrastructure that was not designed for the current fake quality. The Green Seal documentation protects buyers of watches sold new through authorized channels. It does not protect the secondary market transaction where documentation has passed through multiple hands or been separated from the watch. The authentication process that reliably protects a buyer in 2026 involves movement inspection by a watchmaker with specific Rolex caliber expertise before the transaction is completed, not after. That means building the cost and time of that inspection into the purchasing process. For watches at secondary market prices that reflect the genuine gray market level, the inspection cost is a small percentage of the transaction value. For buyers who skip it, the downside risk is not small. Several authentication services have emerged specifically to address this gap, and their rapid growth is itself a data point about how the market has assessed the problem. Watch CSA, Entropy, and similar services are receiving watch volumes that reflect genuine demand from buyers who understand the current risk landscape. The services vary in their reliability and their specific expertise with high-tier fakes. Using one is not the same as using a qualified Rolex watchmaker with caliber-specific expertise. Both are better than nothing. The qualified watchmaker inspection remains the standard that the problem actually requires. The broader question the current situation raises is what happens to the gray market's structural role in the watch ecosystem if the contamination problem continues to accelerate. The gray market exists as the liquidity layer that makes the watch collecting market function. It is the mechanism by which watches move between owners efficiently at prices that reflect current demand, without the friction and delay of the authorized dealer system. Destroy confidence in that liquidity layer, and the secondary market becomes significantly less functional, which is bad for everyone who participates in it as either a buyer or a seller. The watch market has dealt with quality improvements in counterfeits before. The market adapted. Authentication standards evolved. Trust was rebuilt on new foundations. The current situation is following the same arc, with the specific difference that the quality improvement happened faster and further than previous cycles, and the authentication gap that has opened is wider than the market expected or was prepared for. The resolution will come. New authentication standards will develop. Movement inspection will become a standard part of gray market due diligence rather than an optional extra. Dealers who build reliable authentication infrastructure will distinguish themselves from those who have not. Prices will stabilize when the contamination risk can be quantified rather than feared abstractly. The transition period, which is where the market is right now, is the painful part. The London dealer is not getting his money back easily. The collector who paid for a watch with a non-Rolex movement is whole financially because the dealer made it right, and is fortunate to have dealt with someone who did. Not everyone in the secondary market will make it right. The genuine Rolex owner who wants to sell today is selling into a market that has discounted their watch for a risk that has nothing to do with the watch itself. That is the unfair outcome of the contamination problem. The genuine is penalized for the uncertainty created by the fake. And that uncertainty right now is moving faster than the market's ability to price it accurately. If this kind of honest breakdown is useful, subscribing to the channel is genuinely the best way to support it. Every person who does makes it possible to keep going.